Hello everyone, today we talk about the 1683 siege of Vienna, gluing together different aspects of the political and strategical dynamic, as well as the historical background too. Probably the research on the siege for anyone interested in sources, for example. As you know, I dedicated a good part of Schwerpunkt to 17th century warfare, and I have a series going on essentially about like the Turkish wars, and obviously culminating with the siege of Vienna. At some point we will resume also the one about Prince Eugen, that is of course intertwined with this, and also the general development of the European art of war in the 18th century. Today we discuss essentially the psychological aspects, right, of the terroristic means used by the Ottomans and their Tatar subjects during the campaign, and how these essentially triggered that equally ferocious resistance that the Viennese, before the greater armies, the Imperial, the Polish one, came to the relief of the same city, made them hold on enough, right, to achieve the final victory. I have different videos on the defenses of Vienna before the battle, mining, counter-mining during the same. So today we'll look also at that aspect, especially from the Ottoman side, as what is that Kara Mustafa was actually up to, for example, by not implementing a double ring of fortifications, the so-called countervallation around the city. All right, and also, again, how do we know? Like, for anyone that really is interested in this historical chapter, like, how do you get to study these things, and what kind of authors you can read, and sort of what's the general, say, attitude to have, like, towards the topic for a broader scientific interest? Because Vienna, of course, is one of those battles that changed history for real. Like, there is this narrative that, of course, is the cheap one that goes on from the rhetorics of the 1970s, etc. It says, but after all, it was just like a blend of cultures. This was not a religious struggle, or at least it wasn't something that really counterposed two worlds in a climatic fashion, and the Turks were not really just aiming to destroy Christendom, and the Christians were, and you don't even find the answers there, because to how to go on, because to tell the truth, that's just a lamentation against the fact that, yes, it's true, sort of far right, but actually like something more national socialistic, so not really traditional. Also in the imperial essence that we're observing right now, have hijacked the narrative of the siege of Vienna, but of course the latter doesn't ring too good with the failed, right, attempt at multiculturalistic and sort of relativistic approach to history. But this is a battle that has a real metaphysical meaning. It really shows you, and that's why it's so important to study in the first place, how close, after all, like, it's, barely, it's not even 3 centuries and a half ago, right? And somewhere so close, so central to Western civilization, like very like European, Central European, in the truest essence of what properly the struggle, in fact, the multi-secular one between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Turks had been, for let's say, dismissing the sort of more positivistic and secularistic approach to history that we've narratively just and rhetorically habituated to, right? Because you can make that sort of multiculturalistic, weird approach to, I don't know, even colonialism, right? Especially like for all those who like to blame Europeans and whites for the terrible things that, of course, no other people in the world was doing much worse than them at the time, in actually incentivizing the same colonialism and slavery that were really normal for the cultures that also were conquered by the Europeans, and it projects you instead towards this sort of in between, like this core of Europe, like this dimension that is in part like it is Central Europe, in part Eastern Europe, in part Italy. If you really want also to look within the Ottoman Empire, of course, in that in that reality, of course, that there were the coexistence of different religions. There were many Christians that were sent to die, and even with some degree of conviction at that point within the Ottoman army during the same 1683 expedition. Think about the Serbians, think about the Bulgarians. There is plenty of of things you can point out regarding that sort of cultural, ethnic tapestry that, in fact, universalistic ideology down to the actual essence of it were embodying, right? But exactly for a struggle, exactly led by the mystical belief, the traditional creed that had always been at the root of like the world up to that point, you can argue, because sort of the most in fact modernistic and lacistic narratives really were starting, yes, in Western Europe at this point, after we are in the second half of the 17th century. Then you have the Enlightenment that wasn't all technically like the anti-theistic or anti-traditionalistic sort of movement. The Enlightenment, it was something extremely vague as a definition, and extremely complex as an actual phenomenon and movement. I'm ever more surprised when history, I don't see actually outside of YouTube, I don't know how many activities exist out there other than at these larger channels level in terms of popular presentation of these topics, and how much actually in the academia. I'm not a modernist, so I wouldn't tell you exactly how much it is published about the siege of Vienna specifically, but it doesn't seem to me that there is this great focus or hype. The sense is that these topics are objectively that complex, as they are part of exactly that modern, the period of transformation that presents you a dual meaning of this all. I mean, the same Siege of Vienna is so epic in a way because it is true that the times had changed to an extent. That for example, the weakness of the commitment, right? It's something that we see nowadays as well. How much once you have acknowledged that one specific political and strategic goal is positive for you, acknowledge that, everybody knows it. Why don't you pursue it with more energy? And the history of the Siege of Vienna is literally until the last day, all those who had supported the relief had not invested in the enormous amount of wealth, for example, from the papal side, or the Poles, the Imperials had not agreed, had not managed to master this enormous forces. It would have radically changed European history. Not saying in a way, again, the catastrophistic way, the Ottomans would have arrived to the river Thames, like Gibbon said, etc. It's, at least in the sense of literally, all Europe conquered. That was absolutely not possible in the, not even on the medium run, but it was just Vienna was the utmost capacity of a stretching. We underestimate how much Poland had been threatened as well. It's a narrative you don't hear often. It was technically possible for the Ottomans to besiege even Warsaw. Doesn't matter how far. and more far from, than Vienna from Constantinople. This actually was, but at the same time, is exactly because, in fact, the Christian defense succeeded that this world showed yet again how the Holy Roman Imperial ideal, the Crusade one, etc., was not just words, was something that, from which essentially the Habsburgic Empire, as we intended as an empire, like exploding, like in territorial extension, exactly after Vienna, with the relentless campaign, not extremely relentless even in that case, were lots of lost opportunities, but came to extend to the degree that you see until the end of World War I as a real might, right? And so it's one of those topics you can never fully exhaust, and the superficiality which it is instead presented is just like, let's get down, let's look at battles and clashes and armor, and but yeah, there's not to say. I think my love declaration is something like, you're more beautiful than the charge of the winged hussars at the gates of Vienna. But literally, I mean it. But let's say the way the event is just described merely in the material dimension, in the fact in itself, and it's, as you know, a military historian specializing in tactics to say that. So I cannot put aside that aspect, but we're saying that there is so much more, of course, beyond that that can help yourself growing together with the era. And that's why I make the series, actually, because if you look at, for example, all the diplomatic background, right, the relations between, say, France and Poland, for example, or between, of course, the same Vienna and Rome, and of course the relations between the Turk and Louis XIV, and the incredible issues in Germany, the Protestants actively supporting the Ottomans against the Catholic Europe. It's something disconcerting, allowing actually a Catholic power like the French one to seize large parts of Germany, just not to end under the Habsburgs, right? That like thinking that this is the heart of Europe, thinking that this involved at such a big scale the entire old continent. Well, that makes you think about what we are, like what we went through to become what we are, and how more aware of the implication of our actions. I would say, like, politically speaking, as always, this is the actual point of history in the first place. How non-simple things are, right? How complexity is not an excuse for moral relativism, as instead history is mostly told. Like, we cannot know, it's difficult to say, let's put everything into discussion. Yes, but then you must do that if there is something that you still haven't sorted out, and you should sort that out. And then when you have come up with a historical conclusion, like, you should make it a point of some sort. It's not to say that it's not, that it's beyond revision, but let's say making moral relativism for the sake of it is just like, let's say anything about anything, because anything can work if you don't care about anything at the end of the day. So that's why I care about, and I also take my time to explain really my point regarding history, because I'm not sure how evident is it why I make these videos in the first place. So regarding the deterrent aspect of the Ottoman cruelties perpetrated across, like, the Habsburgic territories, I made, I think, some months ago exactly, like a video describing graphically the no, it wasn't much about the violence and the horrors themselves, but what happened when the Ottoman army first entered Habsburgic territory, right? And so also the effect on the communities, etc. Like, notoriously, there was there were caravans, enormous lines of people abandoning, right, flooding the roads to Passau, to other parts of Habsburgic Germany that really were showing something like the threat coming from the east, the idea of this barbaric power that acts in a horde fashion to destroy your moral, the world as you have known it. It's something quite actual in still today, right? Even more than it's been for quite a long time, and it's still somehow like what the West has as a core narrative to actually react to the same, to actually withstand. And as a historian, I personally think that most of the times it's not much that those narratives in fact existed at the time. And I'm not even sure they are useful in the sense that it's not that there isn't an enemy to fight against, and that threatens the West, but it's rather the underestimation of the same Western forces has always been like the narrative like of Western Europe. Western Europe has always been disproportionately more advanced than not just the eastern part of the continent, but practically most, if not all, of the contenders that ever fought in the different times in history. And when you realize that whichever of these powers managed to somehow strike, to deal a heavy blow against this system, realize that most of that was coming not much out of a dramatic iron arm confrontation in which the entire civilization had to collapse, had, for example, the Westerns lost this or that battle, but that in fact came from really the fact that Westerners were so better off at a point that they didn't even care if there was even a fairly serious threat next door, but was temporarily just advantaging you in a relative term. And this is the same narrative of the Habsburgs, for example, in the 16th century against, let's say, when Hungary and the Ottomans were fighting. Admittedly, Hungary was a sort of a failed state by that point, and the Habsburgs were sort of glad to absorb a substantial part of their territories after the Turks defeated them. When you actually study the French attitude like towards the Ottoman advances, say against the same Vienna in 1529, for example, as in 1683, you realize that it's not that the French, of course, ever liked. I also made a video about the siege of Nice, for that matter, when the Turks were harbored at Marseille with Francis I's blessing. Let's say they actually wasn't much of a blessing, just a shadow, like obscure permission. That the same French were in terms of, okay, like, let's have the Habsburgs suffering this, and then we will step into Italy. Then we will take matters in our own hand, because at that point we will have to fight against the Turks, and we have actual letters in which the sovereigns were rationalizing, like openly, this idea to eventually commit, as if the Habsburgs had failed, which they wouldn't, like France, to an unprecedented level of investment in Western affairs, at least from Carolingian times, and by sheer proportion in relative terms, and that was still feasible for them. Why? Because the values that laid under their belief actually were still the truly traditional imperial Catholic universal ones, all right, that were moving things also like the Crusades. I detest when there is all just a mechanistic, sometimes even deterministic narrative in anything political. This country has to win, this country has to lose, or for the mere fact they're fighting a war, that is not true, right? In a deep moral and scientific sense. If you do not understand that, it's a problem, right? It belongs to the weak of the world. It doesn't belong to the dominating civilization, and it's extremely difficult to sensitize people nowadays on this series. It's just like a cosplay, like picking a team and signing with that without realizing just for the sake of, whatever aestheticistic or sort of emotionalistic deal is behind that, without realizing that there are objective values at stake even just by taking that side, right? In apparently, non-consequential way that, may be true at an individual level, because also this is indeed the belief of the weak, right? But that when they make mass and there is nobody else like above being that strong to simply like make things work a bit faster, can cause this important landslides, right, in the history of civilization. But usually also the odds get balanced at that point. That's also what history shows us in a military historical sense, but not only. Like, it's of course a political issue, and in that you also notice that in fact there is a reason why sometimes the West takes it so long, because they see there is still something, you can still achieve something by waiting a little bit, and then finally, just when things are getting dire, right, you're okay, like now we have to step in seriously, right? It's in a very strong sense a constant of the world, depending of course on what it is at stake. This is true for every civilization in a sense, but civilizations do these things differently, and there is a value of merit in the difference, and that's also the other part of the story that you're usually not told, because it sounds like, oh my god, it's a racist or this kind of thing. It's actually real. It's actually world history, and people should study a bit more, right? So the brutality, like even this aspect, right? Peoples who brutalize simply their opponents, or perpetrate senseless massacres against civilians, etc., or not even actually supporting them, are also sort of the most desperate in a sense. They're the ones who are trying to achieve like an emotionalistic, in fact, reaction, because they are sort of the ones more habituated to that. Oh, now we will scare each other. Like, think about the saying, like, here let's not mention single peoples, but we have often described the differences between civilization, say the sanitary civilization and the steppes world, right? And we've seen how, of course, the latter was always weaker, right? Achieving a relative advantage in some regional context doesn't mean that they were to go anywhere, the general sense is that those systems are being more fragile, more changing. They also tried their best, and they were actually fine. Like, they're very interesting cultures to document. I have a video about the Khazars scheduled for tomorrow. But in many ways, like, after this sort of fear, like trying to inflict this psychological deterrence, then what are you actually gonna do, right? And why do you do that? Like, what do you think to achieve, like, just through that sort of scare? Just think about today in terms of nuclear saber rattling or this kind of stuff. It's notorious, like, from any strategic analyst, seen as just like a declaration of weakness of some sort, especially when at least there is a relation between nuclear powers that is also notoriously, say, outlineable. I don't even know whether this term exists in English, but on a strong basis, even against like a general, like an Holocaust or moment of large destruction, etc., there is still the guy who has the upper hand, and the other one knows that, so that it's not just senseless at some point to try to annihilate each other, but the way it's going to happen to you is going to be worse, right? If you as you perfectly know, because that's actually where fear really strikes the most, and shows who is the weaker, right? Manifests and declares what is really at stake, and the substance was from both sides, right? So the destructions, the cruelties carried out by the Tartars, that were in 1683 the vanguard of the Ottoman army, these peoples being specialists really to laying waste, right, and really looting and terrorizing, but also could not stand alone, like as an actual army. That's, I think, very telling, as was just, the dichotomy that I was just illustrating. The purpose, right, of breaking the enemy morale was not really achieved, right? Terror did spread. This is not to say it didn't happen. I also made a video titled, if I'm not wrong, "The Great Fear of the Turk," that actually talks the post 1453, which is a thing, right? That Europe really was scared at that point. At least there was a lot of liberalistic and sort of cultural depictions of the Turks, represented as like the usual Eastern monsters, and actually they were in fact a greater threat than that, because they weren't just like that, or at least there was a civilization back in the Ottomans, right? But when, of course, you have to, even as an Ottoman, resort to these kind of means at a point to overinflating your capacity to scare, there is something that doesn't work, right? If you insist on that, it tells more about the sort of milieu to which you're habituated, rather than the enemy. That if you really want to deal a heavy blow against, you have, if anything, to catch by surprise by making lower the guard, right? And this is not to say that, of course, like in absolute terms, it was not done, right? The same 1683 campaign was relatively carefully planned by the Ottomans in that direction. It was the Habsburgs who really did not believe, in fact, that something big would have been possible, such as the siege of the same Vienna, right? Even though just 20 years before, hadn't the Imperial forces stopped the Turks at the Battle of St. Gotthard, Vienna was at the time actually without defenses, right, without fortification, and it would have been practically, it would have fallen, right? So this is reckless behavior from, again, sort of the cocky Westerners, but it's important to observe how what we get in terms of this mythology of the Turk is mostly from an overwhelmingly more outputting civilization like the Western one, in terms of, again, printed stuff that is also directed in this gradual phase of sort of democratization, let's call it in this ugly way, of information really ends. That is, scaring the weakly, the easily manipulated, the lesser elements of society by saying, "Oh my God, the Turks are arriving!" And of course, in all the courts of Europe, let's say the political guide, the strategic analysis was good enough to say handle the general matter, even when, of course, they were sort of more or less overconfident, and that is not even necessarily it is coming from somewhere, especially at this point, when the relation with the Ottomans and the wars, especially with them, had been going on from quite a while, right? From a couple of centuries, and also with sort of equally threatening possibilities in general. So terror would spread, and rapidly so. The same Viennese were quite depressed during the siege, needless to say. When you find yourself in that condition, it's normal, like at all levels, to feel down, right? To see your present non-existent, just thinking about what you had up to a few time before, and looking forward towards the future, and essentially working for that. On the other hand, what this comes with psychologically is rage, right? Is anger. It's a very important ingredient here, that this is the difference really between sort of feeling depressed, that is actually what most people do, as opposed to actually being depressed, which is sort of a different thing, even though like the boundaries could be blurred to an extent, but I'm not going to digress on this now. And that, however, was a very important ingredient in the very firm, right, and tenacious will of the defenders to exist at all cost. Right. At that point, it is more in that irrational dimension. Remember the Clausewitzian Trinity and what the people is connected with. That is primordial hatred. Right. So it's the most irrational element that, however, with mass is the one that is fueling, right, the military and allowing properly politics to carry, in this case, this resistance out. Right, and that's something that, in fact, different peoples internalize differently depending on the situation. The Turks being on the offensive, having, in that sense, the opposite problem. Like, even if the narrative, for the sake of happy endings and all this, right, it's, oh my God, the Turk was overconfident, and yes, they were to a degree, but it's not that they weren't suffering of all the strategic and logistical issues of the case. Right, and the violences perpetrated across the Habsburgic territory were quite under the literal eyes of everyone, and together with all those idées reçues, we can say, about the same Turks that we were talking about before from centuries, right, and that especially in Mitteleuropa were extremely lively. Right, because there wasn't really a real boundary, right, between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, right, even just in a territorial sense, in a way also culturally, because there was Hungary in between that was split between the two, right, and we're talking about a frontier in which people regularly roasted each other alive, cut children to pieces, so there was also, just the part of all the stories of these horrors were out there, where they would keep fueling our own fantasies. Think of still Bram Stoker, or the sense of this violent, wild, terrible stamp force that lives in the demonic veins of our world, and it has to do ultimately with ourselves too, right? And in all this, the actual result was increasing the will to resist, not actually decreasing it. Right. The awareness of one's own value was stronger than these people. It was not to say, oh my God, we will all be subject of the Turk. No, these communities said, like, it's better to die. And I think it's actually something extremely coherent, right? I don't know, like, it's not to say that you can easily say whoever you are, okay, I prefer to die just in, I don't know, living in subjection or, against this enemy, whatever. But in a rational sense, like if you want to attain a very specific goal, like winning a war, for example, well, it is kind of makes a lot of sense to say, okay, I will die for it. And people do it, right? And I think also in today's world, this is very much under our eyes, and to reduce, of course, war in the way pop culture does, as a technicistic mechanism for which you have to discern at some point where the balance is going to tilt, even if the war has yet all to be fought, right? It's sort of like a form of escapism. It's not a symptom of mental soundness to great extent, right? So this resistance would be noticed by the Ottomans, but unfortunately we do not know too much about their side as much as we know from the Christian one. At the end, we will see that we obviously do have Ottoman sources, right? And they do, in fact, speak very interesting things in terms of what they saw also the Christians like, even in the moment in which they were offending them, right? And these were resisting, right? Which is not just, again, a cocky mentality. It's rather, like impressive in that sense, and that's why when you really realize how much Westerners regularly underestimate themselves by scale, right? And the reason was very simple. There was no other hope, right? That's the actual deal. The best way to survive, literally, in a biological sense, was not to surrender to any cost. And it's actually very simple. Like, in terms of general calculation, fighting to the death, because the alternative is death, is what makes a people fighting to the death, right? And that's something you don't want to give to a people, right? That's if you don't want to see it united immediately against you and alienating great parts of, the of its chunks. If you want to, in fact, to go in the opposite direction. This happened repeatedly in history, and it's also strange how we don't learn this. I say we in the sense that, again, for how normally people think about politics or war in general, right? These stories were running like crazy, right? In part because they were happening for real, in part because there was also propaganda that worked pretty well, but we know that historically founded this ruthless enemy that massacred, raped, enslaved. The Ottomans, as you know, had a very sort of, in fact, non-Western sense of, like, they were very Western in many ways, especially their military tradition and sort of the way that the empire had been born in many ways. But the differences with the West were quite marked, as far as, for example, that consideration of a spark of divinity and more, like in the average person, right? The capacity of course, showing people that if they really wanted, they could achieve something. When you have the cream of your own army that is literally children / slaves that you have essentially drawn from subjected peoples and converted them forcibly, well, you understand again that there is an extremely different sense of how you're normally habituated to cope with subject population, right? And so if you were someone fighting against these guys, you would know that to that system and the worth of your life were absolutely, in fact, more important than the loss of the latter. Quite frank. There were almost 3 centuries, again, of terrible fame that surrounded the Turk, that usually kept playing for this because most of the peoples he had to cope with, also to maintain this enormous empire, right, from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, from Sudan to Ukraine, of course required that sort of scary effect, right? Because if this had been properly like a regional reality, essentially overlappable with the previous Byzantine one managing, right, to rule over these other peoples that, of course, just for the fact that had been brought down, did really fear the Turk and could be terrorized in that fashion. Again, what laid west, what laid north was a bit more complicated, right, to deal with. So you gotta understand the Turks that were, after all, smart, right? That they were managing again to keep together this enormous empire, being essentially at war constantly on 3 different fronts, and you gotta give them, like, how didn't they collapse before historically, even during these periods of peak of their power, right? And that therefore had needed, in a way, to keep spreading this terror that still did have some effect on the enemies, but also, of course, it's not even remotely close as the decisive factor in the system. They knew, by the way, that they could provoke the opposite outcome, that is, that aforementioned desperate will to resist. This was probably, we do not know, because we didn't interview him, overlooked, right, underestimated by Kara Mustafa, right? And there was a specific objective of his, that is, at least an interest from the side of the commander to essentially force the city to surrender rather than essentially destroying it, right? The reason of his underestimation of the entire forces involved, that were, again, let's remember, quite evenly balanced, as all the great clashes really are, derived, however, dangerously from his contempt for the Christians, right? He was an incredibly, he was a Christian hater in many ways. There were Ottomans that were sort of course, pious Muslims, but did not have that particular personal hatred against the Christians. And in this sense, it's likely that one of the factors that significantly helped the Christians in the siege of Vienna 1683 was the underestimation of their own courage and valor, especially when deprived of all options, right, of all hope, right, by the side of the Ottoman leader. Naturally, as we will see this, we have already appreciated in other videos, there were great experienced commanders that would contribute to the Christian victory. The same thing about Starnberg, that had been also in this situation, which the Imperial Polish army was not yet assembled, and the Viennese were to exist, right? That organized the defenses, that held that very strong, blood and soul defense of every inch of the city against this overwhelming Ottoman force. We were talking about one of the most fiercely effective and updated militaries of the time. It's not before Vienna really that the Ottoman standards are going down, right? There is all a narrative that says, well, but you see, even the same battle of Vienna was won because the Westerners had better firepower. It's the military revolution, whatever. The Ottomans were technologically backwards. If Montecuccoli's Feldmarschall, examining the Ottoman gunpowder from the captured camp of St. Gotthard, told you that the Turkish power was excellent, right? And let's remember the fact that that was essentially the most important technological factor, from, in fact, the time of the granulation of the power. That was an Ottoman invention, or at least they were the first to bring to to an army level. And the bayonet, the reality is that the Ottomans had actually pretty good forces at every level, down to the technological one, without mentioning that it was plenty of Western advisors / renegades, depending which power we're talking about, that served in Turkey, right? So underestimating the enemy, right? This would have been fatal in great part, especially in a moral sense. Kara Mustafa neglected to provide, and this would be really crucial in the battle. Anyway, this underestimation had quite practical and direct consequences in the Ottoman positioning, for example, and fortification, better relative lack of fortification at the siege of Vienna, right? First of all, Kara Mustafa essentially wouldn't provide the immense encampment of his army of an adequate line of defense towards the external, right? This is notoriously what basically the thing it is usually said is that the Ottomans had entrenched themselves too much in the effort of let's say mining and trying to bridge into Vienna before the enemy relief arrived. That's one thing, yes, but it could have been partly obviated in the ways Ottoman resources were distributed by establishing a countervallation, as we will see now, which is even more odd when you realize that the Ottomans surely had their own intelligence, reconnaissance, like the Tartar explorers that were almost, as we've seen in other videos, about to capture the entire imperial family while this was retreating from Vienna to Passau along the Danube, right? Would have told him, would have of course kept him informed of, right? The forces mustered by the empire, by Poland, were big. There was no way they could have been missed, right? So naturally, there was a lot of uncertainty. This is not to say that they had a crystalline, clear idea of how many enemy forces were out there, what they were made of, what this would have entailed. At a particular moment, there are some aspects of course, the Ottoman operations that we can't know at the decisional level. I think that they were very competently thinking about the entire picture, but again, for some reason, the Ottomans were notoriously not prepared to cope adequately with the Imperial and Allied forces, right, gathering around Vienna. And when, of course, they acknowledged how many troops had arrived, it was sort of too late to at least cope with them with the support of further fortifications that had been around, as we'll see now, since the late 16th century as a mean to, in fact, be protected by the relief force, right? We made a video about the classical influence on let's say in that case, especially the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War. Well, the siege of Mons, as we will see, of 1572, had provided there a great example of something that, after all, you could read from the Commentario de Bello Gallico, right, having happened at Alesia, right, under Caesar's command, with a great host of Gauls out there to come to break the Roman siege of the Celtic Ottoman. So the Grand Vizier in 1683 had, so there are hypotheses, because again we do not know fully the entire story, the opinions, etc., had to at least have among his convictions that surrounding the city with an immense encampment, just in a sort of psychological fashion, saying we are so many that we can simply park ourselves in front of your capital and waiting for you to surrender, because that's how much we think that, you know, things are gonna go. It is in a sense like there is some positivity, some effort, but you also have to look at sort of more practical ones, of course. And that an encampment, let's remember, that wouldn't at all surround the entire perimeter of the city, which is, like in siege warfare, actually an important issue. And that, together with like pretty sustained assaults and continuous bombardments, mining the fortifications of Vienna would have brought the defenders to surrender before the time the Christians would have managed to reach Vienna with a relief force strong enough to oblige the same Kara Mustafa to break the siege himself. One of the reasons we were pointing out before was also that Kara Mustafa wanted the city, right? He didn't want to have the ruins of Vienna. He wanted to take it substantially intact, right? He had instructed his forces, just like by the modus operandi, were acting like this was clear, right? Kara Mustafa wanted all the Viennese treasures, of which, of course, he would have obtained the best part. And if he had managed to conquer Vienna in an impetuous way, his men would have had the right to loot, but to him, only a miserable pile of ruins would have remained. So the idea of having the Viennese surrendering unblocked, right, and granting the city, and so with all the many treasures that had remained there, and just like you can imagine, like still the inhabitants, parts of the inhabitants' possessions, think about the churches, there was a lot of Vienna that in terms of assets you couldn't quite transport away that easily, in spite of the exodus that had taken place by that point. This act of arrogance, if you want, pretending that the Viennese at that point hadn't set their minds on resistance, that surely can be broken, right? But that evidently provides you with that lack of chances to simply think that these guys are going to surrender from a day to another, is evident also in the tempo that eventually the Ottoman operations did take when they did realize they were under pressure, that a relief force was there, right? The Ottomans were true experts in siege warfare. They had quite advanced, essentially, Stoßtruppen tactics, like the ways they would attack the enemy fortifications are very reminiscent of, World War I trench assault. You bombard the section of the enemy lines that you want to attack, you make it blow up with mines, and then you immediately assault it, and you repeat, right, until the line collapses, right? And in a sense, you have to understand Kara Mustafa because he counted on his evident military superiority. He was convinced that simply deploying it around the city would have been enough just to intimidate the defenders that, yes, can have set their mind to fight to the death, but it's not necessarily that they're literally going to do it till the extreme last, right? When especially you manage to break through, and then at that point, yes, you can fight to the death, but the Ottomans are at that point without the disadvantage put by the defenses, and so they simply overwhelm the garrison that is much smaller than their forces, right? And again, I made lots of videos already on Vienna that exemplify how properly also the tactics functioned like. And there was, of course, like a price to pay. Like the more you angered the Ottomans, the more you frustrated them in preventing to prevail. When they would have entered, they would have not showed any mercy, and so you would have had at that point to accept not just your death, but rather like the dying part that is definitely the scariest one. They also knew that, let's say, at this, Kara Mustafa thought that this would have happened in a short while, right? In any case, this is probably where the Ottomans had not fully studied and absorbed the Western advancements in the art of war. Right, that's something more complex. It's not just about technology, as we were saying before. Yes, the Ottomans could have been technologically advanced and all, but it was since 1572 that in the aforementioned siege of Mons by the Spanish of the Duke of Alba that the besiegers used to install themselves between two lines of fortifications. Right, the counter wall that surrounded the the besieged settlement, and the circumvallation. Right, so actually before I was talking about the countervallation, but it's actually circumvallation that is a bit longer. Right, it's destined to break the assault of the army that is coming to relief. And this, of course, is quite important, because if you can allow yourself, especially when the enemy is not yet out there, to simply frustrate your force, and you can at least unmask, and you have free hand to concentrate at least part of your engineers, of your sappers, not just in the zigzag trenches that are arriving under the enemy battlements and then the mining. You could essentially create a sort of another settlement all around. Naturally, say the circumvallation is not like the problem solver. Like, it's not really as hard of a fortification like the gradually, consolidated ones around specific centers really are. But it's still something that can support you, can help you greatly to in fact fence off like an enemy attack. And usually this is built already in a way that, of course, is serving the specific like vectors involved in that attempt of siege break, meaning that you're not going to build this from a direction you don't think the enemy is going to arrive, right? And so there is a need, first of all, to isolate the enemy besieged center, right? And that is the counter wall. And then you have this outer wall, which has, if you want more options, because it doesn't have to keep literally people out. It has in a single direction, one like the one at the center that can make people escape from any direction, because after all, a meaningful relief force is expected to come from a specific direction. Also, the counter wall had to be calculated in a way that the first lines of the trenches were outside of the range of the besieged artillery. That's the one properly surrounding. This was normal. It was something going on since ever in military history. There were, normally it was a bow range. It's a medieval time, right? Crossbow range. At this point, artillery played a more important role. The width of the perimeter of the circumvallation thus was like an important work, right? It depended not only from the size of the city that had to be taken, but also by the dimension of the besieging army itself, right? So in the Ottoman case at Vienna, it was an even longer and costly work to carry out for an army that was already pretty invested in, again, trying to make the enemy collapse in time, and that was particularly strained logistically. Vienna posed, in this sense, yet another problem. That is to say, there is all a water system constituted by the Danube and his affluents, and by his canals that at the time were also much less sort of controlled than today, and so complicated really the terrain exploitation all around for a permanent control, like especially from certain containing structures, right? Um, in this sense, it was impossible to create a total counter wall to the same city already. So the first line, that is the one you want to avoid, like the enemy being supplied from, actually was open, right? In fact, Vienna was replenished, was resupplied in part before the enemy, the relief force arrived. The problem there was that the of course, like even if you pour some troops in, there is just so many that can be sustained, as we will see now, also because of different epidemics within the city. But it's rather like, that the Ottoman force is going to crush the defenders anyway, and so what you really need is the bigger army that is able to directly attack the besieging force and crushing it, right, rather than simply the garrison. But still, there was some link with the outside, with the external. This is not to say that the Ottomans weren't doing their best actually to prevent also the Danubian side of the city to be patrolled, right? But in this situation, as you understand, you have to invest other resources to just control this very difficult sort of swampy terrain that is also preventing you from building a circumvallation that is also going to have some weak points if it's not able to enclose like the entirety of the city. So the Ottomans would try to isolate Vienna in the northern parts on the Danubian side only by, in fact, patrolling constantly the land and the water all around through like literal boats, right? So some fluvial units that cooperated, by the way, with the land ones. The thing was carried out, at least the Tartars were particularly good at this. This was true also, we've seen it in the video about the Polish-Lithuanian army, right? How successful these peoples were from the marshes of Eastern Europe and the great Russian rivers, etc., to be so also expert, like some sort of, say, pioneering force capable of launching amphibious attacks and really affording to operate on sort of any kind of terrain, of course as light troops at the end of the day, but still like helping the heavier ones, right? But everything was very, very difficult even for them, because you couldn't quite control every single branch of the river and its canals. Like if you inserted here some maps of Vienna from the time, but if you have been there, you know how, like, still today everything is very complex. There are different courses. It's just imagine at the end of the 17th century, like how complicated it would be just infrastructurally to control an area of this point. The Danubian hydrography in front of Vienna, and not only there, by the way, because this posed a problem of, what about the forces that can arrive from other parts of the river, not just immediately across at the height of Vienna, right? Is very complex. It was as it was at the time. Actually, at the time even more, as we just observed. And for this reason, the exodus or the escape of single explorers and messengers was possible for the Viennese. At the same time, they sort of would suffer a bit the same problem, because the capacity of getting massive supplies or reinforcements was limited. Also, the army wouldn't arrive from the north, nor it was practically possible crossing in that part of the river, right? it would have not made sense. It would have exposed the forces on the other side to continuous Ottoman harassment. Also, would have not been space to reform, like so. It could have never been done. As you know, just even the same river crossing is one of the most delicate and dangerous operations in warfare, because the moment in which you have to cross, you're not in battle formation. You just start putting forces on gradually on the other side of the river, and if the enemy catches you in between, like, you're sort of done for, right? This is what, I don't know, Prince Eugen would do at Zenta famously enough, to the Ottoman army, right? And the same Battle of St. Gotthard actually had showed how successful the Ottomans could be in such operations, but admittedly that was a smaller, like the Rab was a much smaller river, and just also in that case the Christians were defending rather than simply counterattacking. The Ottoman forces were immense also in that case. Surely, however, the Viennese were in contact with external. They had runners and supplies going across the Danube. Yet, of course, in a measure that the from a military point of view, also at the time by the same commanders and the same Ottomans, right, besieging the city was not considered particularly relevant. In fact, it would be virtually unconsequential. The impression, however, that the Ottoman siege had been carried out in a sort of sloppy way is notorious. By the way, we are sort of well documented as far as the fortifications and counter fortification at the siege of Vienna are concerned, right? The maps are substantially accurate, like the deployment of the same Ottoman forces is understandably sort of unbalanced. Again, today is not really the video in which I analyze this. We take things one step at a time. What really appears tactically unforgivable in the choices of Kara Mustafa is the absence of the aforementioned circumvallation, right? That, of course, was present in some measure, but mostly mobile devices, literally some sort of mobile fortifications that were necessary because, of course, there had to be some sort of protection, some sort of fortification around the same camp outside the counter wall. Yet this is not exactly like the Ottomans digging in, awaiting for an enemy attack from the outside. In many ways, they had not prepared at all, and or they thought that they could have played that game in open field to some degree and having a chance against the relief force, right? But the way the Turks had adapted to the situation, and especially this, again, tunnel vision that literally arrived through the same tunnels under the enemy, say the Viennese battlements, was channeling all those forces in the trenches, in the assaults, that yes, were making progress, but not enough for taking the city before the relief army arrived, right? This, of course, is not just like, again, Kara Mustafa not thinking how to cope against a relief army, or properly the strategic mistake in assuming that that eventuality would have not produced itself in such relevant fashion. The Grand Vizier was convinced that things would have been dealt with quickly, and that there would have not even been the need of a finally victorious assault, right? Nor the necessary time for the arrival of a relief army. This was the general idea, right? And it was, of course, a deep miscalculation that you can appreciate only if you consider, however, the heroism of the Viennese garrison. Because it is true that they were under an enormous pressure and that the city was about to fall. And then again, also from the Christian side, we've documented this extensively, like the way, again, that the relief force was put together was just making it by matter of days that could have really been decisive. So you can argue that the Christians had not been organized, they had woken up possibly too late. But this is also how war is really fought. In the greater engagements, the odds are so evenly balanced that you can't quite say how it's gonna go till the end. And if you think that this is simply predictable, well, you should have been in the stead of the commanders, right? So speaking of the history of the siege of Vienna, and say what kind of things you should read in order to get acquainted with the actual primary sources, right? And so even if you want to reconstruct the siege from them, which is a very complex thing to do, I've never done it, right? I have already my beloved early 14th century, the sources start becoming really a lot. Like if you want to cover everything in terms of naturally not just what happened. This is a siege, by the way, right? I normally reconstruct battles, but there is not, in fact, even a great focus on. So at least battles are studied somewhat, not serially and comparatively, but at least they make you at least sell books. And Vienna did have a battle, of course, but the siege, right, is much less studied just as a type of operation, and instead it would require a lot of comparative interest. I did something about the, say, 16th, 17th century art of fortification. We will go on with that, so we explain something, but never told the history of a siege. In fact, that's what I'm doing step by step in this series, right? But reconstructing the whole thing is very complicated, but you can go by that. So remember, because some of you ask me for bibliographical advice, and my answer is often elusive, because I believe that everything is so easily accessible that if you just make a simple search on the internet, you can find everything you really need. If you want to read a book about the siege, if you want to reconstruct the thing, it starts becoming a bit more on your own. It starts becoming a bit more complex, because also particular studies on the siege are not necessarily fragmentary, but they don't tell you literally everything, right? They don't tell you what's the work of the sources behind that, or at least they of course quote them, but there is a lot of stuff that the author read, of course, that you didn't. So what is giving you there is some like that, and I don't know, unfortunately, too many good experts of the art of war, if there is truly any at this point. But the history of the historiography of the siege and the Battle of Vienna are interesting. there is a long tradition, right, since those very days, that is provided by the really many. This is also very often the limit, in fact, for some good art of war history, like the amount of the sources, right? So many prints at this time, books, like booklets, gazettes, also like single pieces, like of printed, like single papers, like, at some point were circulating, also in ways that unfortunately, just because again you can't preserve everything, you can't quite study adequately. The Flugblätter, that is local flyer journals that again are also not reconstructible in the circulating exact circulation, etc. But this started circulating immediately after, aside from the, of course, all the sources on the Seige, also the diplomatic level in the archives. You can find really a lot of stuff, and I suspect that like, I think this is a well exhausted topic to some degree, but I presume that there is always something to discover when we talk about the end of the 17th century, etc. So, but these are probably down to like local info, right? Started circulating immediately after the liberation of Vienna from the Ottoman siege. And thanks to all these sources, we know literally day by day, but also hour by hour, and even, I'm not exaggerating, minute by minute, the events of those terrible 60 days, right? It was 2 months. And so if you really want to have fun, like on this enormous volume of material, you can definitely also say your own thing, right? After you have adequately studied and try to of course reconstruct specific aspect of the same. So we know very well the exploit of the attackers and the ones of the defenders, the acts of heroism and ferocity, the damage to the urban buildings, right? There is all an interesting archaeology of Vienna that if you have visited her, taking the time multiple times, I'm a great fan. It's one of my favorite cities. You can't really stop by and say, yes, of course, everything changed a lot. But if you're a bit expert, if you have looked at the old prints, the old maps, you can almost see this. For example, I remember last time I was in Vienna, I had a hotel, and I don't remember the name, but it's just like outside, like the south, like the old walls. And in fact, this is exactly like where the Ottomans were, right? With the enormous Ottoman camp it's insane, right? There are lots of Gedenkmal scattered around the like the city, and this even in the suburbs of single acts of hero. This is valid for like the surroundings of Vienna. If you want to visit Petronell-Carnuntum, for example, that has, as you know, quite a, especially if you follow the series about the Prince of Ghent, quite a meaning there. But I mean, it's really like a universe on its own, and the Viennese surroundings are just very, very interesting. There's all the history of the fortifications is quite fascinating. We know where certain mines were blown up, the bombardments, the sorties, the same. This is fascinating. The history of not just propaganda, but properly of information circulation, whether true or false news. How what else? Like how for example, the jackals were put down, right? Those who were preying on the abandoned property, the deserters. We're told about the prayers, the hope. Like you can make a history of psychology, right? Hope and lack of it, fear, and something really much more terrifying, right? If you have just eaten, don't just skip the following 5 minutes video, but if you're talking about hunger, thirst, the infected wounds, there was in Vienna specifically, like I don't remember how it was called, but it referred to the pinkness of the color because it was a bloody diarrhea, right? Had spread, and as you know, these things were killing people, of course, more than the Ottomans were, like, I don't know, there is a fascination with this stuff as well, because it makes you realize, just imagine if you had been there, right? I don't know if you've ever been into some, hopefully not, but, as I explained in the video about the way where the fire of death blazes, there is a necessity for of the Dionysian in order to achieve the Apollonian transfiguration. If you've ever been under the weather, if you've really been at some point in your life aching physically or spiritually, like there is like in death, in many other aspects, like just imagine what these people went through, and you realize that most of us haven't to that degree, and just imagine like the sort of let's say comparison, like in comparison to what you lived, what it would have been to live in that situation. We have lots of eyewitness accounts about the Battle of Vienna from both sides that informed us in an adequate way, and sometimes even in a boring fashion. I mean, you reading these sources is beautiful, but sometimes like, the passages are even boring. There are, of course, mistakes. Sometimes the information provided is willingly wrong, right? There are lies. This is sort of obvious because of the partisan background that we all have. So you can imagine in those moments. Also, the fog of war was really blending with this all, right? But in spite of this, and I'm really, as you know, a proponent of this because I work mostly with narrative sources. Actually, these authors, and I'm not the only one thinking this among the scholars who studied the Battle of Vienna, actually they're all very reliable, right? If you study narrative sources, you realize that after all, the entire distrust towards them, and there is a thing specifically in the Anglo-Saxon world that always privileged scholarship over properly the primary sources, and especially the narrative ones, saying like, since this is our narrative source, we can trust it. We have to have a scholar that tells us how it really went according to him, right? 300 years later or more, because of course he knows better, right? And this attitude, in my opinion, has never really helped anyone. If you are habituated to study with this say narrative material, you know that they not just write very interesting things. When you especially contextualize them in the reality, the contingent reality, but that these are writing because of course they have a purpose that is positive, that is, even when they're lying, right, telling you something about that world, and they are, however, overwhelmingly objective, reliable, accurate, insightful. It could have not been otherwise. I mean, imagine yourself being into a war, considering the impression that it can make on you, etc. And wanting, of course, to write what you've gone through, what you have seen, what's been the deal. Like, it's more likely like someone detached from it that wouldn't tell you how it really was, right? So they're all, like, all these authors are discreetly reliable. Also, what method do we use to tell the history of the Siege of Vienna? Some scholars, also recent ones, have chosen to reweave, in a sense, the events, the patchwork technique, that is to say, the sum of the descriptions, like put together in a way to give the impression of this wider, accurate, analytical account, of course conveniently omitting or dissimulating the gaps and the contradictions. I don't like this way of going. I mean, I like when I like always to cite extensively, like where I publish, like the only criticism that I get from peer reviewing and from the say the team that assists me, like the scholars behind the screen, is the notes are too long. People don't want to read that, or at least it doesn't look nice on the page. Well, if the person wants to know why I write that, yes, it's not nice when you make a statement and you reflect on something and you just cite a source, but you don't explicitate what the source says, right? Instead, I'm very logical in my method, and I want to be above criticism of any kind. And for this reason, I say, look, the source says this, right? And in this context, however, we can interpret like this. Like, the patchwork technique is not great because it lacks this comparative approach, right? It simply says, oh, look, let's pretend that what is written on this account is just like about this episode is just like a movie a movie scene that I can insert in a broader video, and then I'll tell you the story like that. That can work for cinema, but not for history, right? So the patchwork is cool. I like to make patchwork only when you have an accurate criticism of the sources, right? A pregressed analysis of the same that tells you, look, this author is this guy, wrote for this reason, and whenever we're going to quote him, it's because what he says is legitimate because of this and that reason, but we will do it together by saying, look, this other author says the contrary of that, right? So I explained somewhere how to write articles and stuff, and I will come back on it. Currently, I'm writing to be published by the Bundeswehr, at least, hopefully, because it's like the first time. And just when you speak to the military as well, you must be, let's say, you must show what military historians are capable of doing, because I think there is a duty for us to inform the armed forces as well what technically the art of war is and how to study that, like to complement it also in a theoretical way with what the military does for a living, but not always war. Say fortunately and unfortunately. In any case, there are of course other works that reconstructed the ephemerides of Vienna during the long siege with more acute spirit, we can say. And we have beautiful, fascinating, it's sometimes also difficult, like this on the long run, pages of authors like Victor von Renner, Reinhold Lorenz, John Stoy, and also of other authors, of course, that drew in turn from these authors. So again, one of the reasons why I actually don't use sources myself is that, like, if you do not even know these authors, it's because you've not even run a background check on the internet. On the internet, you can't find that reliable information in general, but you can at least find references, right? Finding sources has never become as easy as at this point. So if you haven't even done your homework as far as that is concerned, why should I literally do that for you, right? But in any case, we have, and again, I insist on this, the primary sources that are very often splendid accounts drafted firsthand by people who were literally within besieged Vienna, other people who fought like they were in the army proper, or that found themselves, this is interesting, as chroniclers or hostages within the army or the encampment of the Ottomans. For example, we have the diary of the military magistrate of the Imperial Army, Jan Peter van Velkeren, that is drafted in Latin and Dutch and translated in multiple languages. We have the diary of the Viennese garrison officer Johann Georg von Hoffmann. Besides the accounts that we get from the Ottoman side, but that had been drafted by Christian observers / hostages, such as, for example, Benagliel was the secretary of the Count Caprara, or the Count Marsili. Or otherwise, we have probably the Turkish ones. There is the beautiful and famous chronicle of Evliya Celebi. There are beautiful images, such as, for example, I talk about this in the video about the Seige, that is sort of more comprehensive of all this stuff, like probably when the Christian cavalry descended from the Vienna Wald, that he says that the green on the green of the lawns downhill, you had this this armored horseman descending like a black pitch, like expanding, like, it must have been insane. It was the most famous cavalry charge in the history of mankind. We have the embarrassment of the choice in that regard. Like, what is beautiful about researching on different sources, especially long chronicles, etc., is that when you have spent some years reading them, and you can't say to have known all of these works like individually so well, but you already know a bit the person behind the chronicle. You know how that guy writes and thinks and explains things. He has a distinct characteristic, is the distinct tone and flavor that there is in his pages, something that you cannot find somewhere else, right? And it sort of fixes itself into your mind. It becomes one of the most important way to qualify and analyze the same sources also with one another. There are so many different episodes naturally that emerge from the campaign of 1683. Different engagements, some may seem more or less important. Alright, there are also some other different, curious even, and picturesque sides, like not necessarily the military ones. Right. So one good way of operating is surely, like, I'm not going to should make another video to explain how to make such works, and I admittedly never studied like an entire campaign from a period so importantly documented like the late 17th century. I don't think that this probably, I assume, like, in general there is much more, and there is, especially as a general background, but let's say something you can start to find by scale from the late Middle Ages in the first place, and it requires all a specific method that I'm still explaining it in like telling how I wrote my doctoral thesis over the years, and the series about PhD tales that I have just there at that point we have to resume. So it's important to deal with the you do have to find a narrative, right? But you must not force interpretations with one another. Sometimes you may not have time, especially if you are like you have a deadline or whatever. But you cannot simply write something, finding an explanation that sort of doesn't make sense. You already know when you write it whether it makes it or not, right? If you're still undecided or sort of, it's unfounded, like when there are two different sources, two sources saying two different things, right, about what happened. It's not just two, right? But you have to make sense of the whole in a way that is able to draw like some general information about the event, right? You have to be coherent, right? And sometimes it's really an arbitrary thing. There is a component of arbitrariness in the historical criterion. Historians must sort of limit, by definition, their own research, because otherwise, how do you even start telling a historical event, right? You can't quite do it. It's not even like Clausewitzian to presume that, I don't know, you can just write about the military side of the story, because how do you explain the moral forces, right? If you don't look at other things that are not military. And when does the political aspect, start, right? How did the two contendants hate each other on the basis of what they had been doing for centuries at this point, right? So it's important to underline the gaps. It's important to highlight the contradictions. You have to always be positive and write something that makes sense, and not leaving the reader with the feeling of, I don't know what happened, how do we do, how we can go on. You have just to avoid false coherence. You have to be honest, where or not. And it's important when in fact things do not make sense for you as a historian, especially when somebody has not profitably explained or even tried to certain incongruences. You have to do it. Like, you have to address the problem. You have to say, well, this is a problem, and sometimes we don't have an answer. There is no enough evidence or data. Like, you can make hypotheses, whatever. And reality, this is how you should think it is the litmus test, right? Reality always, it's not that it escapes per se, but it destroys what is wrong, right? So historically speaking, you can't write something that evidence, when started, destroys, right? Reality does not get destroyed by what people think. History is destroyed by reality, and history is written by historians, so you can imagine what the common person can hope to do against history, let alone reality, right? And again, this is not a bit about the historical method, but it's important to realize at all times what are the challenges of history, because if you read, as I was saying at the beginning, like, how do you read this history? Why do you read it for in the first place? Why do you get interested? Well, we see that the average pop culture is, oh, look, I read this thing, it's so interesting, and I'm showing it to you. That I think the most interesting thing is, of course, people should read, etc., but is, why do people choose to read this? And that is often overlooked. It is often, well, because people are free to do whatever they want. Yes, okay, but what does this have to do with the soundness of their choices, or just the reasons why they decide to read something and not something else, considering the immensity of all what has been written in a sound way, and why people decide to focus specifically on that. You always have to answer this, because if you don't, you can't properly make history yourself. And it's only history that makes you reason this way, that I know by personal experience, because before that you just think there is a sort of history written, sculpted somewhere in the firmament, that instead is just history written by people. And people make mistakes, including yourself, so just entrenching yourself, as people often do, behind, but I read on that book because that historian said it, so it must be true. Do you, like, the only thing that legitimizes you to discuss histories is having read enough to understand at least like what all the sources available on that topic more or less say, or at least what the historiographical consensus overall is, but why. Right? Only at that point you can start understanding. And of course, whatever is said by historians, not just like a point collector for you to say, oh look, this guy said this thing, so this other thing that also has usually nothing to do, because making logic work is yet another challenge. Actually, so it's complex, and I'm not, let's say, being. I don't want to go too much at length, but this is also the history that we care about, right? So this channel, I get an increasing number of people. I realize that wanna watch my videos because maybe at some point they're at least more entertaining than they were in the past, but they skip this passage. They're literally like, those children that they're never being shouted at, they've never been disciplined by their parents, and for the first time somebody tells them to stop doing something, and they freeze because literally nobody has ever told them to do. Like, this is the kind of idea, like we have habituated actual adults to pretend that everything they think is relevant because it's them. Right? We live in an age in which now those children now are adults and they actually believe this because nobody has told them that it's largely BS. Right? And history, true history is this. It's not, again, some cheaply condensed information that you can pontificate about without any clue whatsoever. Right? You may think now I made this great analysis today. Of course not, I hope. This is literally nothing in comparison to the actual history that you have to begin to make in order to even start to understand what this historical event really is. So if you consider in perspective all these barriers, well, I think that you can have a much more intelligent grasp of reality and say getting yourself doing something. It's sort of weird that YouTube is starting. It's apparently a trendy, it's apparently a trending issue of some sort. Life is useless. Nobody cares about me. I can't change. My life is over because everything was decided at birth. I can't do anything. Like, there are actual people who are out there. They're so spoiled. They're so ungrateful that they believe that since, yes, they have problems, it's done, and they want attention for that. So they can't keep on actually self-sabotaging them further into doing nothing with their lives. And that's not really, like, it's a very painful display in many ways, but history provides you with all you can need for growing up like a person, and then finding your way and being consistent with it, right? History is a research, and is ultimately the research of yourself and your self-actualization. In any case, this is definitely not the first, and unless something happens to me, of course, in the meanwhile, not the last definitely video that we'll make about this evergreen of the 1683 siege of Vienna. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.